So welcome. I'm Darius Moshfeghi. I'm Chief of Retina at the Byers Eye Institute at Stanford University. It's my great pleasure to be joined here today by Derek Van Amerongen, who's Vice President and Medical Officer at Humana in Ohio. And today we're going to be talking on the topic of honing in on the appeal process to improve access to anti-VEGF therapy for our patients with wet macular degeneration. So by the end of this activity, you should be able to develop and implement approaches to a systemic and clinically supportive appeal to ensure uninterrupted anti-VEGF therapy for our patients with wet macular degeneration. Derek, we've all been here. Can you go over why patients get rejected and how to go about having a collaborative, non-confrontational appeals process?
Absolutely, Darius, and I really appreciate your framing this up as the opportunity to make this a collaborative process. The goal for payers in using prior authorization is not to make physicians' life more difficult, although I know a lot of people feel that way, and I totally understand that. I'm totally empathetic with that perspective. Rather, it's that as an administrator of benefits, it's our fiduciary obligation to make sure that treatments, especially treatments that are expensive, especially treatments that have potential safety issues, are being used in the appropriate clinical settings, that they're being used according to the FDA label, that they're being used according to the best standard of care, and that we're not seeing treatments being done in an experimental or investigational way or one that is inconsistent with any of those standards. So understanding that, then I think it makes it a little bit easier to understand what payers are looking for. And also when we're talking about the issue of prior authorization denials, understanding that when something comes back to you for additional information, it's not meant as a rejection. In fact, it may not even be classified as a formal denial. It may come back saying that we need additional information before this can be fully processed. I would tell you that probably the most common reasons that we send something back are very simple reasons. In fact, sometimes are almost ridiculously simple. We don't have the member identification number, or the identification number is wrong. We don't have a diagnosis. We don't have some of the coding, such as the ICD-10 code. We don't have other patient identification that helps us understand if this is a valid member, that's someone who has their insurance in effect, and also any information about the physician or the healthcare team that will be providing the service. Part of our challenge as payers is that we really are obligated not only by state regulations, but also by the importance of making sure that we're providing good service to our members, but also our physician customers. We want to provide timely service. There is no inherent value in delaying responses and making things, as I said, more difficult for the physician practice or the provider. But of course, that really depends upon getting all that information so that we can minimize the administrative hassle. And I would also say minimize the administrative cost. As we've seen, the vast majority of requests and authorizations move over the years from sending in letters to moving to fax, now to electronic. We've seen a significant decrease in the cost of this administrative process. And that's good for everybody, because if we can make this process more efficient, if we can turn around requests within a business day, sometime within maybe hours, if we have all the information there, that's obviously good for the practice, it's good for the patient, and certainly it's going to hopefully mean that we're going to moderate the cost of doing business for everybody.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. I mean, we've been treating since 2006 with these anti-VEGF medications, and really in the last 3 to 5 years, we've just seen a sea change in our ability to streamline the whole process and get everything done. As we see on this slide here, it's very important to get treatment going on board. We know from the original Marina trial, which used ranibizumab, that was the last study in neovascular macular degeneration to have an untreated control arm. And when those patients were finally crossed over and started receiving therapy up to and including monthly therapy, they never gained their vision back. So once you lose vision in this disease, it's gone and it's not potential to get back. The best you can hope to do is kind of lock in at that new low level. They can go and say, oh, it's only a little vision. But we find out that that vision adds up over time, as we see from this long-term follow-up in the 7-UP study, is that 2 letters here, 2 letters there. Next thing you know, it's some real vision. And as I noted in one of our earlier talks, is that it matters at the level of where you're at. It's very important for many individuals to maintain their sense of who they are, their independence, their ability to get around just by being able to maintain their driver's license. And in most states, that visual acuity ranges anywhere from 20/40 to 20/80 in Arkansas, if it's in your better eye. And so you want to have good vision. And if you fall below that level, suddenly your life has changed a lot. And so I have found that the authorization process has improved a lot. But sometimes you run across this problem and you put in for an authorization, or you tried, or for whatever reason, your authorization was denied. What's your next step? Okay. One of the things you can do is appeal via letter. You can go to the website of the specific pharma company, and they often will have all sorts of information about how you can get a hold of your payer, and they have form letters for you. And then, of course, there's different ways that the pharma companies themselves will actually try to supplement the insurance plans in cases where their specific medication isn't being used and you think that's important. So when we go back and we start now looking at it like, how do I do this? And one of the first things I like to do is contact my office manager, because frankly, I don't really deal with these payers one-on-one. This is all being done by the back office. And so then in the case that we're running across a problem with either a particular medication, a particular disease, or a particular payer, then I call around and say, hey guys, you know, my private practice colleagues, my colleagues at other universities in my area, and it's important to find out, you know, they said all politics is local. The same thing applies here with your payers. Usually it's going to be a regional issue, and you should try to figure out what's going on and get to know what's going on with your region. And then if that fails, then you can reach out to your national organization. We have the American Society of Retina Specialists, which is our kind of our go-to organization for really lobbying on our behalf. And they have a ton of resources on their websites. The American Academy of Ophthalmology has been very involved. Of course, they're not just retina specialists, although we like to think so. And then, of course, you know, we have smaller organizations that are equally efficacious, and then there's patient-based organizations. Derek, as you said, you guys aren't interested in denying us from the purpose of denying us. You're just trying to make sure that the patient is getting the proper drug. Can you give us the payer's perspective on what's happening when a denial occurs?
Sure, Darius. And I would say all of the things you mentioned just a minute ago, those are great options. Although I would tell you, again, that the number of true denials is very few. And I think
I agree with
a lot of physicians would actually be surprised at how few true denials. Now, if you get a request returned because there's something missing, and you know there's no information about treatment plan, there's no code, that obviously needs to be completed. But that really is not officially a denial. But I think you also pointed out a great thing when you said that you don't handle this, your office manager does. And in many respects, that's...
I'm so happy for that.
Yeah. I think that's a best practice, because to take a physician out of the examination room and ask him or her to fill out a form which he or she is not familiar with and go piling through the EMR to find codes and dates of service, that really is not a good use of the physician's time. And actually, payers are not expecting that. We're not expecting that things have to be filled in by a physician. It needs to have the relevant data. And typically in specialized practices such as ophthalmology, gastroenterology, oncology, there are people in the office who do this on a regular basis, and they know this stuff inside and out. But when you think about a true denial, and we're talking about some of the things that you need to understand, as we're pointing out on the slide, you know, if you do end up wanting to talk to a medical director and make your case for why a particular request should be approved, it's important to understand that medical directors at health plans are using the medical policy of the plan as the basis for the discussion. So I say be familiar with it. All plans have their medical policies online. It may take a little digging around, but if you go to the website, go to the provider site of the payer website, you should be able to find the relevant policy. And if you can't, you can certainly contact the plan and ask them to send it to you. It's not a proprietary document. It's really available for anyone to review. So understanding what that policy says will obviously go a long way to making sure that your request is in fact lined up with the policy. And if it's not, then you can identify the areas where it differs and then address that. You know, when I see appeals that are successful, invariably they're based on medical literature. In other words, the reason that the plan may have denied coverage for drug X is because the patient didn't meet criteria. Now, here's an article from last month's, New England Journal, JAMA, an ophthalmology journal, that shows that in fact drug X has been demonstrated to be effective in this particular scenario. What I'm getting at is having some type of evidence-based support for the request is really critical to making an appeal successful. And we understand that science changes and that new data comes out, and that to wait for the FDA to include that in the label may not be realistic in terms of the clinical imperatives of the present case. So having that information in your pocket is really going to be important. I would say, however, as you can see in the second bullet, it's important to understand that benefits are not negotiable. And by that I mean that if we have a scenario where the service is clearly not covered, and I would tell you that it's highly unlikely that anything in ophthalmology falls into that category, but my favorite example to help explain this to people is if you have a flood, but you don't have flood insurance, it's not covered. I absolutely believe that you had a flood, and you don't need to send me pictures of your basement full of water, but if the certificate of coverage for the patient does not cover a given service, then that service can't be covered. And that is actually a regulation in virtually every state that prohibits a plan from doing that. And again, as I said, that's a rare thing. It's unlikely to happen in ophthalmology, although you could certainly imagine some type of, experimental surgery or things like that. But it's important to keep that in mind. And if the request really revolves around something that is clearly cutting edge and probably still in the experimental stage, that appeal is not likely to be successful. And as I said, having an understanding as we look on the next slide of why the appeal was issued is really important, because addressing those deficiencies are going to be what the discussion between the requesting institution, the requesting provider, and the payer are really going to revolve around. Making sure that the plan's response is carefully reviewed, looking for all of the information there about why the request was sent back. Plans are usually very specific. They will send what looks like a form letter, and yet if you move past the first few lines, you will typically see specific statements about why this request was not approved or not processed. And addressing that and sending it back should absolutely be the first step. I would also say, and I think this is just so critically important, let's not any of us put the member in the middle. There's certainly that knee-jerk reaction on the part of everybody to say, well, I'm having trouble with ABC health plan, so I'm going to call up the patient and tell him or her and get her involved. That is absolutely the wrong way to go for so many reasons. First of all, Darius, you made a little bit of a misstatement when you said that the patient's request was rejected. Really, this is a request from a provider. The provider is
Correct.
asking on behalf of the patient, but the interaction is between the payer and the provider. And the last thing I think we want to do is drag the patient into the middle and get him or her involved in something which they really have no competency to evaluate. We don't get called up by the dealership and saying, we're having trouble with the people sending us the carburetor for your car. That's not my problem. That's not my issue. That's yours, doctor, and that's yours, health plan. You guys work that out. And involving the patient really just leads to an unhappy situation all around, because it creates a lot more difficulty in ultimately getting this resolved. As a payer, we always want to resolve it. Now, I would say that the typical appeals process is that after a denial is issued, the physician is able, and I would say encouraged, to appeal if the physician really believes that this is a situation where this treatment should be given. In every health plan, that appeal will be addressed and reviewed by a different set of medical directors than the ones who issued the original denial, in order to keep that process as transparent as possible. If that is denied, then it will typically go potentially to an external reviewing company. Plans employ external reviewing agencies who are paid not by their approval or denial rate, but simply on a retainer basis to review that. They will look at everything that was issued or created during this process, and then give a determination which the payer is bound to accept. In other words, if they do overturn the denial, then the payer is required to accept that. If that fails, then the last step is to go to the Department of Insurance in your state. And the ODI exists to handle those types of issues. And so if a physician, if the health system really believes that this treatment is the right way to go, even though it has gone to the internal appeal and been denied and the external appeal and been denied, I would still encourage the provider to think about sending it to the Department of Insurance.
Derek, once again, an excellent summary, and I'm learning all sorts of interesting things. So as with most things in medicine, it really comes down to documentation. You know, this will help you out from a payer perspective, from just understanding your patient's own healthcare perspective, medical, legal perspective. And the more you document, the better off you are. The next take-home message I got is, don't go tilting at windmills. If your coverage isn't covered, don't try to get the payer to do something that they're not obligated to do, and actually will be running afoul of their own mandates. And then finally, if you have something that's rare and unusual, I don't think that the payer is perhaps the person to go for. It may be worthwhile to get after the fourth party, which we haven't really spoken a lot about, which would be the pharmacologic company, to see if they have some program that can deal with these evolving or very rare indications for use. Otherwise, you can use the big studies, the randomized, multi-center controlled phase 3 trials that get published in these amazing journals, New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, The Lancet, what have you, to support your claims when you're going back. But in general, my experience has been that the companies, the payers have been more and more receptive and proactive, and they kind of understand the landscape in a very high-level, sophisticated manner. Folks, I appreciate it. It's been great spending some time with you, and I look forward to chatting with you again in the future. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Darius.